Today at 5, we're in Glasgow, where the biggest summit meeting ever held in the UK is already underway. The summit is widely seen as the last chance to save the planet from irreversible damage caused by climate change. Earlier, the leaders of the world's richest nations were meeting in Rome, where the climate challenge was spelled out very clearly.
Quite literally, it is the last chance saloon. We must now translate fine words into still finer actions.
Also on the programme, 3 people have died and another is in a critical condition after a group of paddleboarders got into difficulty on a Welsh river. And Chelsea cruised to victory against Manchester City to reach the final of the Women's FA Cup.
Very good evening from Glasgow, where the biggest summit of world leaders ever hosted in the United Kingdom has opened today. And the stakes could not be higher. As the Prince of Wales said earlier, this meeting is the last chance to save the planet from irreversible damage caused by climate change. Leaders from the world's wealthiest countries, including Boris Johnson, have been attending the G20 summit in Rome, and they're now on their way here to Glasgow to join their colleagues at COP26. First, our political editor Laura Kunsberg reports on the day's events in Italy.
A Roman Sunday stroll. A stylish canine seems the perfect accessory among the ancient alleys. What conflicts, what epic political struggles have these streets seen? History round every corner. Then spot 15 of the most powerful leaders in the world taking in the sights. A coin in the famous fountain to guarantee a wish. But it might take more than tradition to stop the UK and France pulling away. Others watch on as the two allies are stuck in a spat over fishing rights in Channel waters. Even Boris Johnson wanted Italy to inspire progress ahead of the COP climate meeting getting underway at home.
If we don't act now, the Paris Agreement will be looked at in the future not as the moment humanity opened its eyes to the problem, but the moment we flinched and turned away.
What chance do you think you really have of making progress with 200 countries in Glasgow when you haven't made enough progress with 20 countries here, and you don't seem able to sort out the question of a few dozen fishing permits with one of your closest allies, with the French?
We had a wide-ranging and frank discussion, as you'd expect, between long-standing friends and very, very close allies.
Downing Street had even contradicted his claim that both countries had agreed to sort it out. For Number 10, it's up to France to back down on its threats to disrupt trade across the Channel. The view from his presidential palace is that both countries had agreed to take mysterious-sounding measures to resolve the spat.
The irritation on both sides of the Channel shows no sign of fading. And for Boris Johnson, a rumbling row with an important ally like France is not exactly helpful, just when he's trying to achieve a far wider, grander aim, persuading all of his counterparts from right around the world that slowing down the changes to the climate is a non-negotiable whose time has come.
It's not easy, though. Some countries don't want to move as fast. The Russians questioning the UK ambition for countries to absorb as much carbon as they emit by 2050.
Why do you believe 2050 is some magic figure? No, I want an answer, because you're asking the question, being convinced that 2050 is non-negotiable.
But the Prime Minister has regal backing, and for the heir to the throne, it's been a moment long in the making.
Now, after, I suppose, very nearly 50 years of trying to raise awareness of the growing climate and environmental crisis, I'm at last sensing a change in attitudes. Ladies and gentlemen, COP26 begins in Glasgow tomorrow. Quite literally, it is the last chance saloon.
C'è Johnson, ibridatemi, c'è Boris Johnson, sono Giusy.
As the diplomatic caravan moves from Rome's streets to Scottish streets, Boris Johnson still has a lot of arm twisting to do.
Do you like Rome?
Love Rome.
Hope may spring eternal. Reality does not. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Rome.
Well, here in Glasgow, certainly no one is underestimating the challenge facing the delegates over the coming 12 days or so. And to confirm the urgent need for action, the World Meteorological Organization has just published its annual global climate report, stating that the past 7 years have been the hottest on record, with far-reaching repercussions for current and future generations. Now, the Cabinet Minister chairing COP26 here, Alok Sharma, said that this was the last best hope to achieve the goal of limiting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. Our science correspondent, Rebecca Morell, has more details.
A gloomy start to proceedings in Glasgow, but there are high hopes for a sunnier outcome. In a socially distanced conference centre, a reminder we're still in a time of COVID, as Alok Sharma formally takes the reins for what some say is the last chance to save the planet.
Floods, cyclones, wildfires, record temperatures. We know that our shared planet is changing for the worse. And we can only address that together through this international system.
The World Meteorological Organization warns today that these extremes are the new normal. But it's developing countries who are suffering the most, and they say the onus should be on richer nations.
Malawi, like many countries that are developing, have been at the receiving end of climate change issues, pretty much brought by those developed nations who continue to emit so much carbon.
Central to these talks is a vital number, 1.5 degrees. If temperatures go above this, we move into dangerous territory. The world, though, is already 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we're seeing the impacts of that right now. But even if every country does what it's promising, we're on course for 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. Activists are demanding more action now, led by Greta Thunberg, mobbed as she arrived in Glasgow. But she says there's still hope.
If we can't keep the global average temperature rise to below 1.5, then we do 1.6, and then 1.7, and so on. We can always prevent things from getting worse. It's never too late to do as much as we can.
But after nearly 3 decades of talks, there are questions over how much can be achieved here. The fate of the planet is in their hands. COP26 has officially begun. Rebecca Morell, BBC News, Glasgow.
Well, let's spell out then what negotiators here in Glasgow need to achieve, or at least hope to achieve, by the end of next week. More ambitious targets to cut emissions are needed, and that means more action to limit global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, as we mentioned. Cutting down on the use of coal is essential. It's the most polluting fossil fuel, but many countries are still very dependent on it. The effects of climate change are already clear, so countries and communities need more help to adapt to that new reality. And also the money. How much help will richer countries give to those nations worst affected by the effects of climate change? Bangladesh is among the most vulnerable, so our science editor David Shukman looks now at just one village there and to see what it needs.
In a village on the coast of Bangladesh, people are using mud to try to hold back the sea. It's all they've got. The rising level of the ocean means they're getting flooded more often. And we saw the same villagers struggling in the same way back in 2009. The people who've done least to cause climate change suffering the most from it. It's a forecast of climate scientists to write, and the sea rises even more, maybe by a metre by the end of the century. Well, how on earth are these millions of people going to cope? With life so precarious, this community has long been desperate for international help. That's why Shorbanu Khatun wanted to share her story at the Climate Summit in Copenhagen 12 years ago.
Welcome to...
She told me she was pleased to be there and believed that world leaders would do something. They didn't. And now Shorbanu's life is tougher than ever. Extreme weather is striking more often, and there's still very little assistance.
We have no idea what we can do. If people can help us, then something can change. We don't have the money to move to other places. I have nothing that I can give to my children.
Along some stretches of coast, there are now rows of sandbags to try to keep the sea at bay. And a new school provides shelter during cyclones. But fresh water is harder to find. Most supplies are contaminated by the rising sea.
More than a decade ago, developing countries were given a promise that by now they'd be getting $100 billion a year in climate aid. Well, here we are at the Glasgow summit, and that promise still hasn't been fulfilled.
The 100 billion was just a promise that is not being kept, and its importance is that leaders who made the promise are not keeping their promise, and therefore these leaders have no credibility.
Back in Bangladesh, Shorbanu says she doesn't want her children and grandchildren to suffer more than she has. But they're facing a hotter and more hostile climate, so there's real pressure for the talks in Glasgow to get somewhere.
Well, the conference centre is just across the River Clyde behind us, and David Chuckman, our science editor, is inside the centre. David, we've talked about the warnings, and we've heard the Prince of Wales spell out what he thinks is now the stakes, if you like, at stake here. What do you think they need to do by the end of next week?
Well, bluntly, the world is still heading in the wrong direction. If you add up all the promises that different countries have made to tackle climate change, we're still on course for dangerous levels of warming, with a very long list of severe consequences, from melting of the ice sheets, accelerated sea level rise, challenges to agriculture, growing enough food, the risks of mass migration. And that's why the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and so many others are extremely worried as we go into this conference. And one thing that particularly disturbs them is the disconnect between what global leaders are saying about climate change and how important it is, and what they're actually doing collectively, which so far, in his view, isn't nearly enough. So the hope is that during the next 2 weeks there will be a shift in political will to put the world on a different and safer course. But as things stand, it has to be said, and I'm sorry to report this, that things don't look particularly optimistic on that front.
David, many thanks again. David Chuckman there, our science editor. We'll have more from the opening day of the COP26 summit here in Glasgow at 10 o'clock tonight. But now let's join Clive for the day's other news.
Hugh, many thanks for that. Now, 3 people have died and another is in a critical condition in hospital after a group of paddleboarders got into difficulty on a river in Wales. 5 people were rescued from the water uninjured. Severe rain had led to turbulent conditions on the river Clive, and police have begun an investigation. Thomas Morgan has the story.
At 9 a.m. yesterday morning, rescue services were called after a group of 9 paddleboarders, part of the South Wales Paddleboarders, were in difficulty on this stretch of the Cleddau River in Haverfordwest. Around 30 firefighters from Mid and West Wales Fire and Rescue Services worked alongside the police, paramedics and the Coast Guards in the rescue operation in Pembrokeshire. Police confirmed that a member of the public also jumped into the water to help. 2 women and a man, whom the BBC now understands as Paul O'Dwyer from Port Talbot, died at the scene. Tributes have been paid to Mr O'Dwyer online.
A yellow weather warning for rain was in place at the time of the incident, and it had been in place since Friday, meaning the river levels were far higher than usual. And one local resident described the conditions at the time to the BBC as dangerous.
Recent weather conditions and weather warnings have meant that the river was flowing high and fast. The conditions of the river will form part of the investigation to understand the precise conditions that the paddleboarders found themselves in.
The rest of the group were taken to Withybush Hospital outside the town for treatment. 5 were discharged, but 1 remains in a critical condition. The families of those involved have been contacted as the investigation to exactly what happened here yesterday morning continues. Thomas Morgan, BBC News, Haverfordwest.
The government's latest coronavirus figures show for the UK that there were just over 38,000 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means on average there were 40,580 new cases reported per day in the last week. 74 deaths were recorded. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. On average, in the past week, 157 related deaths were recorded every day. In rugby union, England's women have beaten the world champions New Zealand. Abby Ward scored twice early on, but it was Ellie Kildunn here with the pick of England's 7 tries in their 43-12 thrashing, a record-winning margin of victory over the Black Ferns. The result means England remain world number 1, ahead of the delayed 2021 World Cup in New Zealand next year. Chelsea have beaten Manchester City 3-0 in the semi-final of the Women's FA Cup. They'll now play either Arsenal or Brighton in December's final. The latter stages of the competition have been carried over from last season due to the coronavirus pandemic. Here's Ben Croucher.
This year's Women's FA Cup is nearly as old as some fans, but after delays due to the pandemic, the final is in touching distance for Chelsea. Erin Cuthbert's opener was within reach of Karima Taib. It didn't mean she could stop it. Manchester City's third-choice keeper got hands on Chelsea's second too. Today, of all days, was turning into a nightmare. City's array of injured stars were helpless as the defending champions managed to block their own path to Wembley. Chelsea will be heading there for the first time in 3 years. Beth England made sure of that.
And that's their ticket to Wembley, well and truly booked.
A December date for fans of all ages to look forward to. Ben Croucher, BBC News.
That's it. We're back with the late news at 10, now on BBC One. Time for the news where you are. Have a very good evening.
He wants tomorrow's news today.